Thank you. So we are starting another sermon series where we're looking at what it looks like to really walk with Jesus. We've been doing this all throughout the year, if you've been kind of following along with us as a church. And if this passage sounds familiar, it's because a couple of weeks ago we looked at the version from Luke that pretty much said the same thing, but never fret. None of us pastors are capable of preaching the same exact sermon twice, so this will be new and fresh for you. But I want to look at this passage and I want to look at it in its context. Because Jesus makes this command of, hey, if you really want to know what this looks like, you got to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. But in the context of his gospel, he's giving this as a series of kind of last commands and last teachings he's given to the disciples before he goes. And even starting in verse 21, it gives us the context of where this conversation is happening. It says, from that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed on the third day, and on the third day raised to life. And then it says, Peter took him aside, and this is kind of the back and forth that happens pretty much every time Jesus says, hey, I got to go. I got to go do something else. This is sort of the purpose that I'm here, and his disciples don't understand what's going on. What do you mean you have to leave? What do you mean you're going somewhere else? Why would you leave? Look at all the cool stuff that's happening. Look at all the healings that you're doing. Look at all the followers you have. We had like 5,000 dudes just show up for dinner a few weeks ago. What are you doing completely throwing all that away and saying that you're going to leave now? To a point here where it says that Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, which is a bold strategy with Jesus. And he says, never, Lord, this shall never happen to you. You're not going to be arrested. You're not going to be beaten by the Jewish authorities. You're not going to die. None of this is going to happen because we're going to protect you or God's going to protect you. This can't be this way. It says that Jesus turned to Peter and said, get behind me, Satan, which is a pretty good diss. Of all the things to say to someone in all of the Bible, get behind me, Satan, gotta be draft pick number 1. You are a stumbling block for me. You do not have the mind of the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. And then Jesus goes into the 2 verses that we just read. And so reading those 2 verses that we just read in context of the verse that happens right before it really starts to give us an understanding of what Jesus is saying. So after Peter rebukes him, and he says, you are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but you only have the concerns of yourself. And then he goes into this next dialogue. Like, if you really, really want to be my disciple, you must deny yourself, your ambitions, your desires, and you must take up your cross and follow me. Now, this is an intense teaching. Listen, one of the things that's been true about my really entire life in ministry of talking to people, especially about the Bible, is that a lot of people, don't know if you've heard this before, or I don't know if you've had this same experience, will read the Old Testament and will struggle with some of the things that happens in the Old Testament. Some of the images of God that we get in the Old Testament, they may struggle with that. You know, a lot of the children's stories that we tell in our children's Bibles, and we have a 5-month-old, and we were given, and there's nothing wrong with this, I'm not making any condemnations on these gifts or these publishers. I get why there's certain things in the Bible we leave out to our 5-month-olds when we're reading to them. But it has like this series of different stories, and you'll read it, and like, oh, you know, the Battle of Jericho, and it's like, oh, and the walls came tumbling down. Well, then what happens next? We leave that part out. But it's that next part where people really struggle sometimes with God. But then the second part of that's like, oh man, I really struggle with sort of the God of the Old Testament, but you know, I'm cool with Jesus. You know, Jesus says like all the nice things, and I feel good about myself all the time. And anytime that I hear that, I'm like, you obviously have not read everything that Jesus says. Which that's one of the beauties about this thing that we've been doing as a church, where pretty much, and I'll tell you, as a pastor, it's a little taxing, preaching on only the things that Jesus says, but when you read just the things that Jesus says, you realize, oh, this is pretty rough too. And this is in that same vein. Because if we really look at what Jesus is telling them, it's like, hey, if you really want to be a disciple, if you truly want to say that you are actually a follower of mine, you need to deny yourself. And not only that, you need to pick up your cross, which at this point, they wouldn't understand kind of the meaning behind that. Because like now, if you sort of look around like any church, and I have one on my necklace, got some in my office, we see crosses everywhere. And it's kind of like our symbol of hope for the world, right? The cross. It's like the Christian symbol. But at this point, when they're hearing this, that's not what it means. When they're hearing this and they're hearing Jesus say, pick up your cross, what they see is the reality of what the cross truly symbolized there. And that was a method to which the Romans would execute people. That's what the cross was. It was an execution device. And not one just because it was effective, but one that was meant to humiliate you, to show the power of the Roman Empire. If you've ever seen the movie Spartacus, which there are several different variations of this, some are better than others. But there's that scene in Spartacus where the rebels are finally put down, and Spartacus and all the other leaders are all crucified on the street leading into the city. And so you walk by and you see all the soldiers that are crucified on the streets leading in. And the reason why they did that was to show the power of the Roman Empire and to show sort of like, hey, look at this weakness, look at this humiliation this person's suffering. And so for Jesus to tell the disciples, you not only have to deny yourself, which we'll get into in a second, but you got to pick up your cross and follow me, is a pretty intense command. And it's an intense command that's not just for these guys that are hearing it, but tangentially it's for us as well. And so we really need to understand what this means. And the reason why we need to understand what this means is because if you've been around our church for the past the last year, but especially the last several months as we've been going through this visioning process, and sort of our new, saying it's a tagline is probably the wrong word, and I apologize. I really struggle with the difference between a mission statement and all this other stuff, because they're all different. But this whole idea of we want to be a church where we are disciples making disciples, well, if we're really going to do that, then we probably need to understand what being a disciple actually means. And every time that Jesus gives a definition of it, it's stuff like this. And so we better understand what we are committing ourselves to as a church if we're actually going to do this. So if you really want to be a disciple, you have to deny yourself, pick up your cross, and follow me. And this isn't the first time in Matthew's gospel that he's used this imagery. It's not simply just right before he's actually crucified. In chapter 10, he does the same thing. He does the same thing, uses the same imagery. In Luke 6, he does the same thing. He uses this imagery. If you really want to, be one of mine, you got to do this. And for the disciples, and you can read through the rest of the Bible and you can read through the book of Acts, you see what this means. That Jesus really means this. If you want to really follow me, you get rid of all of this other stuff, you pick up your cross and you follow me. And what that looks like for pretty much every single one of them is you follow me, you spread the gospel everywhere, even if it means your own death. And for pretty much all of them, that's exactly what it meant. And so this is an intense command. This is different than generally when we take a passage and we do a sermon about what it looks like to follow Jesus. We use the one where they're out fishing because that's more relatable to us. Not that I enjoy fishing, but it's relatable. And it says, hey, basically stop fishing, drop your nets and follow me and I'll teach you to be fishers of men. We rarely talk about this one. And so we can see just throughout the Bible what it meant for the disciples, but what does it mean for us? Because thanks be to God, like in the world that we live in the country we live in, for the vast majority of us, picking up our cross and following Jesus, generally speaking, does not mean following it to our eventual death for believing these things. Because we live here. But what does it mean for us? Because the command is still there. Because this isn't a suggestion, this is a command. If we want to be disciples, this is the command. So what does this look like? What does it mean to deny yourself and follow Jesus? And the answer is it's simple, but it's so much more complex and difficult in practice. Because what the command of Jesus is here is basically, hey, if you want to follow me, then that means you got to get rid of any kind of idea that you're in control of your own life. You got to get rid of this whole idea that you're going to be the king of your own castle. You got to get rid of this whole idea that it's all about what you want, and your will needs to start aligning with mine. When we talk about giving ourselves up to the lordship of Christ, that means taking off our crowns and following Jesus. And for most of us in our lives, I can look very different. Listen, I say this often in sermons of just kind of like reminding everyone here in the room that when we talk about difficult things, just trust me, struggle bus for Scott as well. I would love to tell you that for, X amount of time in my life that I was, really just kind of doing whatever I wanted to. And then there was this one kind of cataclysmic moment. From that moment on, I've been following Jesus 100% of the time with absolutely no stumbles. But that is absolutely not true. Not true at all. There was a season of my life that I thought about a lot this week. We're talking about, second half of 2016 into 2017. Where this whole idea really played out. Because I was going through my life, and I would hear that kind of small voice telling me, okay, I want you to do this, I want you to do this. And I just started ignoring that and just kind of doing whatever I wanted to do, searching for my own levels of happiness. And slowly but surely what ended up happening over the course of that year is that I stopped hearing that still small voice tell me what to do, and I only heard my own ambitions and my own desires. And here's at least what that led to for me. Led to a whole lot of loneliness and self-loathing. Led to being physically and spiritually and mentally broken. And led to a spicy amount of credit card debt. To a point to where if I was calling in the Dave Ramsey show, and Dave was looking at my finance and asked me how it's, he probably would say, hey, Scott, you better get ready to eat beanie weenies and ramen for the rest of your life to get out of this. And so I found myself at a point of complete brokenness. And it took some cataclysmic events for me to realize that this was the ramifications of me trying to be the king and the God of my own life instead of letting the Lord of the universe do it for me. If we really want to be disciples making disciples, then we need to understand what that means for us. And that means discontinuing this whole idea that this life that we live is about us, and taking on the idea and the truth that this life we live on this earth is about Jesus. I remember I kind of went back and forth as to whether or not I want to talk about this openly, because this one is recorded, but hopefully besides my wife and my 5-month-old, no one's watching this, hopefully. Well, actually, I hope many people are watching. That was a crazy thing to say. But I remember when I hit my breaking point. There was one moment in time where I hit my breaking point, where I was like, I can't do this anymore. And I'm very open about this stuff, maybe to my own detriment, but I'm open about it because I want you to understand something. That all these things that you are going through, I don't understand all of them, but I've been in similar circumstances. This is a challenge for you, this is a challenge for me, and has been throughout my entire life. And there was one moment where I remembered thinking to myself, I can't keep living this way. Because if I keep living my life in service to myself and doing my own selfish ambitions, my own desires, and not listening to Jesus, then I'm not going to survive all this. And it was one moment, I was a youth director. Doesn't matter where, doesn't matter when. Well, you can probably figure out when because I gave the timeline earlier. What a moron. But I wasn't living here. And I remember just being, fully transparent. Like I, was a youth director, had to be at church at, 7 a.m. on Sunday morning. It was back to school Sunday. And I didn't get back to my apartment until 4 a.m. 4 a.m. Didn't even go to sleep. Try to eat something, shower, get to church. And I was standing outside. Well, this was in Dallas, I'll tell you, because the heat's a big factor here. And it's unbelievably hot out there. And I was standing out there. It's back to school Sunday, and we were all handing out like ice cream sandwiches and popsicles to the kids and celebrating the fact this new year in the life of the church and all those other things. And I'm sitting there talking to my youth, talking to their parents, and the entire time, all I'm trying to do is not throw up. All I'm trying to do is keep it together well enough to not completely embarrass myself, knowing full well the entire time that if my boss or one of these parents realizes what's going on, that I'm going to lose my job and completely lose all this. And I'm just praying, God, just get me through this. And when I got back to my apartment, I just sobbed. I sobbed because I realized in that moment that I could not live that way anymore. Because I was the guy that was tabbed with standing up in front of these students in Dallas, Texas, and telling them about Jesus. And my life was reflecting the direct opposite of what that looked like. And I knew that if I was going to survive life in general, but more than that, if I was truly going to be a Christ follower, then I needed to make radical changes in my life. But the one most important radical change I had to make was to stop following my own selfish ambitions and desire and to start following Jesus. And it didn't happen overnight. And it was a long season of being continually broken down by the Lord, but then healed and rebuilt. This is a hard concept, but this idea of denying yourself, throwing away who you were, and completely giving in to the will of Jesus is not meant to be something that makes us scared. It's meant to be this offer of freedom, this offer of peace and prosperity, this offer of hope, this offer from a God that knows us better than we know ourselves, this offer from a Savior that knows what we need infinitely better than we do. This offer from a God who saw us in our sin and our infirmities, who saw us in our pain and our suffering, who saw us in our rebellion, and had every right to just wipe us off the face of the planet. But not our God. Our God saw us in that state and came and saved us through what Jesus says in verse 21. From that, I want you to hear this again. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and on the third day raised to life. Why? Because of us. Because when we go through this life thinking, how could God ever love me? Remember that passage, that this was the purpose that Jesus came. That Jesus came for you and for me. That Jesus came for you and whatever you're going through, and Jesus came for me. A guy that could not get his life together and was embarrassed, living with untold amounts of shame. And only through God's love for me and God's love for you are we made righteous. And we are wiped clean and given a new heart. Not by a God that's keeping a checklist of all the things that we've done, but a God that counts us white as snow, that cleans our slate, that looks at us as beloved children, This is not an offer that's meant to cause us pain and consternation. This is an offer that's meant to offer us freedom from all these things. And so my prayer for us today is we battle this idea, because just like when we talk about like, hey, it would be a church that's like guided by the Holy Spirit, and I always say, are you sure about that? Because you really want to be guided by the Holy Spirit. It may take you to places that are deeply uncomfortable for you. It's the same thing here. Sorry, I'm not getting emotional. I have bronchitis. And it's the same thing here. That if we really want to proclaim to the world that we are going to be a church where we are disciples making disciples, then we better understand what that means. And it means to be a people that lay down our own crowns of trying to self-guide our own lives and lay our crowns at the feet of the ultimate King, Jesus Christ, and allow him to guide and direct us every step of the way. Because that's true discipleship, and it's only through that that we can bring others to him. And so my prayer is as we play this last song, and as we sing it, just and maybe take a moment during that and maybe take some time this week to allow the Lord to search your heart. Because here's what I'm guessing. I'm guessing there are things in your life that you're fully open and comfortable with giving to God. There's probably things in your life that you're cool with. Generally speaking, for me, it's always been easy to give God the things that I really have gotten to a point like, you know what? I don't know what I'm doing here. In high school and college, that was dating. Gave it to God, nothing improved. But it took for 15 years, but now I'm married, I have a kid. But it's easy to give God the things that we realize that we can't control ourselves anymore. But Jesus doesn't just want part of this, Jesus wants all of it. All of you. So whatever that is, because we always talk about like, all right, God tells us all these things and gives us all these what may seem difficult commands, but it's an offer of freedom. And that's because God is worthy of all those things. Because it's the same Jesus that tells us in the Gospels, hey, come to me, all of you who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Put all of your burdens upon me, because I can handle them. People of God, don't forget, in this whole deal, the thing that matters more than anything else, that Jesus is worthy of all these things because of what Jesus has done for each and every one of us. You are worthy in the eyes of God. Therefore, that God is worthy of all of our thanks, our praise, and is worthy to follow every day of our lives and give all things to. Let's pray.